Hello and welcome. This is Jayanthi. Namaste Sharada Devi, Kashmir Puravasini. Thus begins a well-known prayer invoking Sharada Devi, the goddess who embodies learning. Indeed, the entire Jammu and Kashmir region was also called Sharada Desh, the land of Sharada, as it was revered as a land of learning and knowledge. In fact, the native script of Kashmir, which was once used all the way up to Kabul, is also called Sharada. Our civilization is rooted in the pursuit of knowledge and culture, and the land of Sharada was its beating heart. Yet today, the civilization contributions of this region are barely discussed. A region that was once known for the arts, music, and theater, now a theater of conflict. The conflict not merely of geography, but of competing narratives. Narratives that seek not only to separate India from her civilizational roots through the use of terms such as India occupied Kashmir, but also to erase the civilizational memories and heritage of Hindus by projecting indigenous Hindus as settler colonizers. So what can Hindus do to preserve their civilization? Our guest, Venus Upadhayaya, shows us the way. Like Parvati, she too is a daughter of the Himalayas. From the Shivalik hills of Jammu, she is a journalist, a senior journalist and writer. In a bid to reconnect with her roots, she began to retrace her ancestry from the northwest Himalayas to the Indus Basin and started documenting the stories in her family. The stories that she unearthed, she started to write them down in an essay series called From Kashmir to Haridwar, which is based on her research into the history, culture, and geopolitics of the region. In doing so, she discovered not just her family stories, but also the civilizational connections of our collective heritage. Welcome, Venus.
Thank you so much. It was a lovely introduction. Thank you, Jayanthi. Thank you so much.
It is such a pleasure to have you here, Venus. These are just wonderful. Let's begin by discussing just briefly the context that inspired your essays. Why and how did you begin writing about this? And why is it important? Why did you think you had to do this?
It was very important for me to do this because I think the crux of human existence, for everyone, for anyone, for anywhere, is basically knowing oneself. And that's from where any quest, any journey, any seeking starts. And so in 2020, when I returned from Washington, I was told that South Asia is becoming a very interesting geopolitical theater because of the conflict between India and China, which had escalated, to the bloody Galwan conflict. And so I was sent back to India on this pretext. And so my main work was basically to look at the conflict region. It was to understand the Himalayan region because the India and China conflict was happening along the Himalayan region. And so as I started to do that and I started to travel in these regions, I realized that I'm also from the Himalayas, right? So when you are from a certain place, you're very oblivious to it. It's beautiful, it's a world in itself, but you really don't think about it. You don't really think about it consciously. But this assignment, it kind of took me to these places. And because I had that space and my media was willing to publish these stories, I started to look into my own region as well. I started to discover things about my own region. And it basically started with one site that I visited. There's a site in my ancestral region. It's called Gurnal. So Gurnal actually means, the word literally means gurus on the bank of the Nala, or you can say seers or learned people who reside on the bank of a river. And it is believed that this was an ancient Kashi-like site. It was under construction, and due to some reason, it had to be abandoned. Today, Gurnal has many springs, surface water springs. They're built springs. There's some ancient technology. They're actually aquifers, and there are two major big springs over there. One is a beautiful spring, it's a walled spring with a narrow gate, which the women, even today, they frequent on certain days of the Hindu calendar. And the other one is where the men go. So as I started to go into it, I realized that if it was an ancient Kashi-like site, obviously it would have been connected, right? That people could come and go, and it had to be viable. It had to be economically viable. It had to be connected. it had to be known to people. Only then people would think that it can be a Kashi-like site.
Yeah.
And more than that, it had to have some civilizational significance for people to think about it that way.
Yeah.
That people who would come to this site would know that there is something like Kashi.
Yeah.
Right? So all these things, and I've always realized that though my region was very remote, means it was a hilly region, still there are regions where there is no road to go and all.
Yeah.
The people and their sense of culture is very evolved. It's very refined.
Yeah.
And you start to realize these things, after you travel, you travel around, you go to other countries, you see other cultures. Then you start to understand what is meant by culture and cultural refinement. And you start to appreciate your own culture.
Sure.
So nonetheless, as I started to look into this region, I first started with the site Gurnal, and I started to go into this history. And I discovered a lot about it. For example, near Gurnal, there is a site called Babri-Danal. So it is believed that a battalion of Baburs, the Mughal emperor, Babur army, when he was moving from Afghanistan to India before he set up the Mughal dynasty, one of the battalions moved from here. So they were actually crossing the river, as rivers were actually the natural routes. And there was a lot of infighting between them. So a lot of bloodshed happened. And so in the folklore, the local people actually remember it like that. And the place is actually called Babri-Danal. So if there was a Babri-Danal, it means that there was a route.
Yeah.
And even in the contemporary world, when militancy, and terrorism happened in the region, the militants and the terrorists were also traveling through some natural routes.
Yeah.
So what we don't realize is that those routes are very ancient routes.
Yeah.
Because the Himalayas, the rivers and the river systems, the springs, they remain the same.
Yeah. You had actually mentioned Uttarapad, which was a very ancient civilizational connection route that extends the whole distance. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So see, Uttarapad, or the ancient Grand Trunk Road, which is believed to be 2,500 years old, it started from the Kabul region, then it went into northern Afghanistan, where today you have Peshawar and Rawalpindi. Then it came in through Lahore, and then it entered into Delhi. Now, as it moved from Peshawar to Rawalpindi, it also had a very important offshoot of Sialkot. So Sialkot was also a very important ancient town. In ancient times, it was called Sakla. And Jammu is a twin town of Sakla. Today, Sialkot, which is in Pakistan, it is just 30 kilometers from Jammu. So, these twin towns, the Grand Trunk Road, it actually connected this region very well. So for that matter, the Mughal Road connected the Kashmir region with the rest of the country. And at some points, these two routes were connected with each other. Because all these civilizational routes, if you look at the geography and you see, there were only two ways to reach the ancient Indian civilization. One was that you come in through the sea, and that is how the colonial powers came into India. The other was territorially. And the only way to enter Indian civilization territorially was through the northern frontier region, or through the northwestern region of India. Because in the northeastern side, you have the massive Himalayas.
Right.
So the only way, if people had to enter, say, how have Greeks come all the way from there into India? So whether they were the Greek Bactrian societies or the Indo-Greek societies, they were all present in this region. And how they were present? Because they've come all the way from there. So they had come territorially. And even the early 19th century, when the Russians and the French were planning to march into India, they were actually planning to march into India through this region as well. So to understand the Indian northern regions, which I mean to understand the wider Jammu and Kashmir region, we have to understand the ancient civilizational roots which have crisscrossed through this region for thousands of years.
Yeah,
And Uttarapatha, or the ancient Grand Trunk Road, was one of the major routes connecting this region with the outside world. And then from Peshawar and Rawalpindi, you had routes going into Gilgit, and then Gilgit was actually connected through the Silk Route. So from there, you could actually go into the Xinjiang region, or this what is today Xinjiang region. You could actually go into Central Asia. You could go into China. So all these routes were very connected.
Yeah. And it just helps facilitate the cultural and economic interactions, which made the entire region really known for learning and attracted scholars around the world. So this and the entire region, this amazing history there.
Yeah, exactly. So if you see the ancient Gandhara and Takshila region, which roughly overlaps with today's Peshawar and the northeastern Afghanistan and the regions above Peshawar, this was roughly the ancient Gandhara region. The ancient Gandhara region was one of the important seat of learning. You can say it was an intellectual capital of ancient India, a very important intellectual capital of ancient India. And it has produced many great people, in the ancient times, like Panani was from Gandhara and Takshila region. So similarly, parallel to Gandhara and Takshila region was the Sharda Peeth. So Gandhara and Takshila region was something like what you can say Nalanda. So how Nalanda University was there, it was the seat of learning. Now, I'm not saying they were all the same in terms of their structures, in terms of their ecosystems. There could be variations, but they were all very important seats of learning. However, the Sharda Peeth was actually older than both Gandhara and Takshila as well as Nalanda. Yeah, but if you plot them on the map, you will see all of them very interestingly connected through ancient civilizational routes. And if people were coming, unlike today, like modern man believes that, we are very advanced and we're very connected and we have the most advanced means of transport. But I think those are external needs. Like you need to take a bus, you need to take a flight, you need to drive to be able to go somewhere. So the ability is actually of the vehicle, or the ability is of the person who has made the discovery, discovered the flight or who is actually flying. But you are actually mostly a consumer. But in ancient times, if you were a seeker, you actually had to have the ability to travel. And that was your capability. If you didn't have that capability, if you didn't have that vision, if you didn't have that strong will, you would not achieve what you are set to achieve. So I feel that's where the ancient civilization, ancient people were very interesting. And the roots were not just about travel. The roots were about the abilities of people.
Yeah. It's interesting what you bring up here. Many people traveled far and wide, far more than we realize in ancient times, because we tend to think, travel must have been extremely difficult. And several people that you just mentioned, I was just thinking about like Panini, he was in that whole area, extremely well known. But along with him, Patanjali as well is from the area. And Patanjali, interestingly enough, is also well known in Tamil Nadu as one of the Siddhas and 18 Siddhas of Tamil Nadu. And actually in Chidambaram, he is supposed to have had a vision, darshan of Shiva. And he composed a stotram there called Nataraja Stotram, where, because he was also, Patanjali wrote the Mahabhashya for Panini's Ashtadhyayi. So he was a very good grammarian as well. So the stotram is remarkable for how, it uses grammar. And Shiva is supposed to have taken Nataraja form and danced in front of Patanjali. So this is extremely important history in Tamil history, and Patanjali is from the other area. And so similarly, Shankaracharya, who is from South India, of course, went to Sharda Peeth, and he's supposed to compose Saundarya Lahari in the same region, which is extremely powerful and famous. So people went around, especially people who were spiritually inclined. Distance did not deter them, and they went around far more. The cultural and civilizational linkages were so strong across the country. And I almost feel like we're more insular today, less aware.
Exactly. So there were certain kind of people who use these routes, and I have discovered, for example, there is an ancient site in Jammu. It's called Purmandal. Purmandal is like, again, our ancient cremation site. And my maternal grandfather was from there. So it's on the bank of the river 𝙒𝙗𝑖𝑘𝑎. And 𝙒𝙗𝑖𝑘𝑎 is actually, you actually don't find water flowing in the river, but the water table is so high that you just need to dig in, say, an inch or a couple of inches, and you actually get water. It's considered to be a very sacred site, and it was considered to be on the ancient route to Vaishno-Devi.
Yeah.
And the folklore also says that, rulers from Kashmir used to come as far as this place because these were the hunting grounds. So now when you go to this place, even today, there is an ancient slab. No, I won't say it's an ancient slab. I think it's a few centuries old, probably. It could be about over 150-year-old. It had descriptions in 4 scripts.
Oh.
Yeah, 4 scripts. So Sanskrit is there, then Takri is there, Urdu is there, and Hindi is also there, if I'm not wrong. But Sanskrit is there, Urdu is there, and Takri is there. Now, Takri was a script that was actually used by traders.
Yeah.
Sanskrit was obviously a script which was used by the learned people.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, just looking at the slab, you can make out the kind of people who traveled, through this region.
Yeah.
So the temples were not just seat of learning. They were actually the nodal points in a society where people could take shelter in ancient times. And I think the entire concept of being a pilgrim in Indian civilization, you go on a tirtha, the meaning of tirtham, the literal meaning of tirtham is when you're able to go beyond a certain point. So you have to have that inside of yourself.
Yeah.
You want to be able to stretch yourself, come out of your comfort zone if you want to go beyond a certain point.
Yeah.
And I think you look at all the ancient Indian pilgrim sites, now obviously you have helicopters and you have solar vehicles which can ferry you straight on these mountain routes. But in olden days, people had to actually go on these routes by foot. Yeah. And there were thick jungles around and wildlife and everything. So the concept of tirtham was a very intimate concept.
Yes.
It was something related to growing. It was something related to letting go of comforts, and there were only a few people who could do it. So either you had to be a spiritual seeker, or you had to be a trader, or you had to be a warrior.
Yeah. The Tirtha absolutely occupied such an important place in our civilizational process. And most of the temples, if you look at them, they have inscriptions in multiple languages. That also tells us that people were comfortable with more languages than one. There wasn't so much regional chauvinism. It's interesting that you pointed out how many scripts there were. Very interesting. Pancha Tirtha was a place that you mentioned as well. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So Purmandal is an ancient site which is devoted to Shiva, and it is in the district Samba in Jammu. Today, if you go to Purmandal, you can see some old buildings, mostly in the Rajasthan style architecture, or probably the Sikh style of architecture. And you can also see some paintings on the walls, but it is still not conserved because a lot of people don't know. Now the administration is making some efforts to conserve and preserve the place and make it a pilgrim site. But my maternal grandparent was from this region. So recently I went into my maternal grandfather's history, because what is very interesting is how these communities have migrated within the larger Indus Basin.
Yeah.
So my maternal grandfather was originally from here. So I found out their homes were today, and there is a Ram Leela theatre ground, and behind it I found some old structures. And my grandma says that my grandfather's uncle had a samadhi over there. So obviously if he had a samadhi, he was somebody important. I have still not been able to locate the samadhi, but that is how you can trace the story. Then under some pull or push factor, this family had to migrate from here to another region in Jammu. But before that, we have to understand why the family was in this particular region, because it was an ancient cremation site. And my community is a Brahmin community. So the main occupation of Brahmins was to provide priestly services. So obviously they were providing priestly services on this cremation site. Since there were 3 kinds of communities which were primarily traveling through the civilization routes, as I was saying, they were either the spiritual seekers, or they were the traders, or they were the warriors.
Right.
And you can study a lot of history by actually understanding how the Brahmins have moved in the various river basins in India. So, for example, my grandfather's family, they moved from the Purmandal region to another region. And then from their region, they moved to what is today's downtown Jammu. Downtown Jammu is where Maharaja 𝙒𝙗𝙗𝙗 had set up his capital. Downtown region is on the bank of the river 𝙒𝙗, where today you have the old Jammu city.
Yeah.
So my grandmom's home today is actually just at the entrance of downtown Jammu.
Right.
So just by studying the migration of this family, you can actually come across very important history. Because even in ancient times, you cannot move to a region until and unless you have water, you have livelihood, you have pastures, or a place where your cattle or your animals would graze, and you had land to grow food.
Right.
That is how societies were.
Yeah.
So a lot of history of this region, of this civilizational corridor, which has actually today gone out of our collective memory, particularly in the past 1,000 years because of the invasions that have happened. You know, we had to go into a defensive mode to basically preserve our culture. So a lot has gone out of collective memory. And I've understood that we can discover a lot by going into individual histories, individual stories, or ancestral stories, or the stories of families. You know, if you start to trace your family heritage, you can actually understand a lot about the civilizational history of this northern corridor.
Yeah. And you have some very interesting ancestors, like Santram Dogra. Could you talk about him? He was just extraordinary.
Yeah, so interestingly, I've recently found this out, that my ancestors come from a region called Pallora. Pallora is about 6 kilometers from the Jammu city today. And surprisingly, Pallora is a great town. So there is a Pallora in Orissa also. There was an ancient port city. So when these historians, they studied Chilka Lake, and the Chilka Lake was once a part of the sea. Now it is a lake, and under certain situations, it got detached from the sea and became a salt lake. But there is a place called Pallora. So there was an ancient Greek port city called Pallora over there. So similarly, there's a Pallora in Jammu as well. And historians tell me, like I recently had a conversation with a very noted historian from Jammu region, Chandramouli, and he tells me that Pallora was an ancient Greek settlement. Pallora actually means the last point of the settlement in Greek terms. So my ancestors were in this region. Today, our ancestral, our Kul Devta temple is there. Next to it, there's a Shiva temple. And I recently visited the Shiva temple. I saw a very interesting old slab, carved slab in the Shiva temple. While the rest of everything is modern because the temple is now made up of concrete and plastered that way. So you actually don't find ancient temples, many ancient temples in this region, living monuments like you find in South India, right? How you find in Thanjavur and Madurai, you actually found these beautiful stone temples. You don't actually find those living monuments of ancient periods in the northern regions because they were all destroyed by, the invaders. But surprisingly, in the Shiva temple, I found this old slab, which I'm still in the process of studying. So my ancestors, under certain situation, they moved from this region, and about 2 centuries ago, I found them in this mountainous region from where my ancestral homes are today. And one of my ancestors, whose name was 𝙒𝙧𝙤𝙪, he moved from this region on a community duty to Haridwar. Because in those days, you didn't have buses, you didn't have trains. So for cremation, if you had to go to Haridwar, you would actually go by foot. So obviously, somebody important must have died that he had to go to Haridwar. Otherwise, there were local sites for cremation and local sites for doing cremation-related rituals. So on a community duty, he went to Haridwar, which was somewhere in the mid-19th century. And on his way back, he was coming through Patiala. So Patiala was a town in today's Punjab. But during those days, Patiala was not a part of the Sikh kingdom. It was not a part of Ranjit Singh's kingdom. Patiala was a separate kingdom. And from the very beginning, they were very allied with British, which meant, among many other things, which meant that Patiala was a very cosmopolitan city.
Hmm.
So Duryodhan was actually on his way back from Haridwar, was moving through Patiala, and he saw a Patiala Maharaja addressing people in some public gathering, and suddenly something happened. There was some kind of commotion, and people started to run around. There would have been a stampede, and this tall man, he controlled all of that. So he was a very tall and well-built man, and he controlled that, and he came into the notice of the Maharaja, who offered him a job in the Patiala garrison.
Sure.
And from there, interestingly, the family history starts because his son, Sant Ram Dogra, he was educated over there. And Patiala has a very interesting history because Patiala had a ruler who died at a very young age. His name was Mohinder Singh. And there was a prediction made for him by somebody in Kashi. And it was told that if you do something good in the field of education, your name will be immortalized. So he did a lot of things. Patiala had a very advanced education policy at that point of time. They had set up many schools, including from the primary level. And more importantly, Mohinder Singh set up the Mohinder Singh College, which was the first contemporary education institution in the entire region at that point of time. So there was nothing like it as far as Lahore or as far as Delhi. And Sant Ram Dogra, who was my great-grandfather, he got educated in Mohinder Singh College. And because it was the first contemporary education institution in the entire northern region, it produced a lot of civil servants for various courts, various Maharaja courts, various princely states at that point of time. So Sant Ram Dogra got educated over there, and because of that, he became the first BA, first graduate in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. He was a Dogra, the first graduate in Jammu and Kashmir. And Mohinder Singh, Maharaja Mohinder Singh had also instituted a gold medal. He was a gold medalist. So all these things are recorded in history. And these are the things which I've also incidentally discovered in the last 2 years. But what was important was Sant Ram Dogra was later appointed by the Dogra Maharaja, third Dogra Maharaja, Maharaja Pratap Singh. Maharaja Pratap Singh was instrumental in the Dogra dynasty for various reforms, for various policy level reforms, judiciary reforms, and all those kind of things. Before that, the Dogra Maharajas were mostly involved in conquest and expansion and settling the boundaries. As you see the Jammu and Kashmir boundary today, it was mostly established, roughly established by the time of second Maharaja. So Maharaja Pratap Singh put Sant Ram Dogra on special duty to codify the customs of the tribes of Kashmir, which meant that before it, there was no consolidated form of civil law, which could settle various kind of civil law cases, which were based on ancestry, like inheritance, like family property inheritance, and all those kind of things. So if there was a dispute, before it, there was no way, no judicial way to resolve it. So he was appointed to codify the customs of the tribes of Kashmir, and his work basically established what gives the customs the force of law. And then it led to a further civil law. But surprisingly, so he was appointed in 1915. He finished his work in 1918. And immediately after, when he was on his way from Kashmir to my region in Jammu, he was killed in the outskirts of Anantnag. So my tracing of this entire history happened because I realized, oh wow, if I had an ancestor who went from this very remote ancestral region of mine to Haridwar, then it meant that this region was connected to Haridwar. There was some way to go to Haridwar. Plus, Duryodhan was a Vartya. So Vartyas were those in the northern frontiers who were warriors and who had taken vows. So warriors are not just the people who were wielding swords and fighting and, there were various warrior traditions. And there is a very interesting school which studies these warrior traditions in UK. It is called the Sanatana Shastra Vidya. So the website is with the same name, the Sanatana Shastra Vidya. So they say that Kandhara and Takshila region was an important intellectual capital of ancient India, and various knowledge traditions, they arose from this Gandhara and Takshila region. And then they went all over, from They're from Gandhara and 𝙤𝙀 region. They went all over India, including to Central Asia, to China, and to other parts of the world.
Yeah. It's wonderful how much they were a source of knowledge, the whole area. And actually, I loved the word that you used, civilizational hotspot, because it reminded me of biodiversity hotspot. And, India is unique in having multiple wonderful biodiversity hotspots where biodiversity is especially, there's just so much diversity. The civilization hotspot word is so apt because I think few other places in the world that have the kind of diversity of civilization and culture that India has. Yeah, I'd love for you to expand on that idea.
I think, Jayanthi, that's a fantastic thought. I never thought about it, like India has biodiversity hotspot. I think our policymakers also need to identify civilizational hotspots.
Yeah.
And that is very important because somewhere a lot of these civilizational hotspots, civilizational heritage, cultural heritage has actually gone out of our collective memory. And so now if I wouldn't have started to trace my ancestral history, as I was saying, so Duryodhan, who was a Vardhya and a warrior, went to Haridwar on one side, and his son, Sant Ram Dogra, went to Kashmir on the other hand. If these people, say about 150 years ago, 100 years ago, they wouldn't have traveled on these routes, I wouldn't have known that such possibilities existed. Now, it's because I have that personal history. If we start to trace personal history, we can first of all find a lot about civilizational history. We can connect the dots. Secondly, the important regions like Gandhara and 𝙤𝙀, like Sharda Peeth, and in Jammu there are many important regions which are waiting to be identified. Like 𝙒𝙗𝙗 is one region where you have the northernmost presence of the Harappan site, where you have a Kushan Buddhist site, which is a very, very important site. Kushan Buddhist site, they've excavated, they've done diggings and all that. And it's again on the bank of the Chenab River, which was in ancient times called the 𝙤𝙗𝙖𝙩𝙤𝙀 River. And there are Gupta period sites also. And this is a site which was on the Mughal route. And Shiv Nirmohi tells me that from Sakla, which is Sialkot today, in ancient times, chariots used to ply regularly between Sakla and 𝙤𝙗𝙗.
Yeah.
So, and even in the National Museum in New Delhi today, you can find artifacts from 𝙤𝙗𝙗. So if you dig more into 𝙤𝙗𝙗, you know more about 𝙤𝙗𝙗, you'll realize that 𝙤𝙗𝙗 is a very important civilizational hotspot.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you study Gurnal, you'll realize that Gurnal is another very important civilizational hotspot. But more importantly, what I've discovered recently is there is another place near my village. So my village is actually a hill, and it is surrounded by rivers on three sides. And at the rear end, 5 rivers meet at a point. And this place is called Pancha Tirtha. And there is an ancient Shiva temple at the confluence, exactly at the confluence of the 5 rivers. And this Shiva temple is a Mukha Linga. It has 5 faces, like how you have in Pashupati.
Yeah.
Mukha Linga Shivlings, they denote a certain history, they denote a certain lineage, they denote a certain tradition. But this is a very remote site today. Incidentally, in an interesting way, this is also the site of one of India's most important geostrategic mega power plant today.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, why was it called Pancha Tirtha? Because it's such a remote site, nobody goes over there. There is a cremation ground. So my village cremation ground was there. And I kept on hearing about this right from my childhood. That, anybody who dies, you cremated in Pancha Tirtha. But I never got to go over there. I got to visit this place only very recently, last year. And then I started digging into it. And imagine, I found a Pancha Tirtha in Gandhara and 𝙤𝙀. Yes. And you know where? In the, so there, Hyo-sang, the Chinese traveler, Chinese pilgrim, when he was passing through this region, he left notes. So his notes on the geography of Gandhara and 𝙤𝙀.
Yeah.
And then it was the colonial archaeologists, British archaeologists, explorers exploring this region. And they have studied Hyo-sang's notes on the ancient geography of Gandhara. Then in that they mentioned that when the British built railways, so between that railways and between the ancient Grand Trunk Road, there is a site which consists of 5 water tanks. It's a Hindu site. It consists of 5 water tanks, and it is called Pancha Tirtha. And why it is interestingly mentioned? Because, so Hussain says that there were many stupas and Buddhist monasteries, and he mentions that in the Gandhara Takshila region, there were also 100 Brahminical temples.
Okay.
And he mentioned 2 important sites. One was a Buddhist site called the Bowl of Padra, which actually signified Buddha's bowl, which actually was carried away by invaders to Persia, and lately was found in Afghanistan. So in 2014, when SI was studying this bowl, it was in the Museum of Kabul. I don't know today. And the other thing, important thing that he mentioned was Pancha Tirtha. So, and can you imagine the only way to go from my ancestral region to Jammu or to Sialkot was to take one of these rivers from Pancha Tirtha.
Yeah.
Because the roads in this region came in early 1950s. And I recently talked with super senior citizens who are above 90, so 95, 93, 96-year-old. And they told me that in their youth, before the roads came, they traveled to Jammu through that way from Pancha Tirtha.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I've dug more into history, and I have written it in one of my essays also, that the Hindu Shahis, who were 1,000 years old, ruling 1,000 years ago, ruling in Gandhara and Takshila region, and they fought with the 𝙤𝙬𝙤𝑖tes for 25 years. 25 years they fought. And with each war that they lost, they kept on losing their territory, they kept on losing their treasury, they kept on losing their people. And they were pushed from their kingdom, away from there.
Yeah.
But if you read into history books, people mostly say, okay, they merged into the Kashmir royalty.
Yeah.
Because, there were marital relations between this royalty and that royalty. So mostly historians say they merged, but when you dig deeper into it, and I've written in my essays with references, that, and even Shiv Nirmoy says, that when they traveled from this region, they actually came to my ancestral region. And then they set up 4 small hilly kingdoms. And they mostly lived a very low-profile life for long because they were literally hunted. So Ghaznavi used to literally hunt these people. Anybody who would help the Hindu Shahis would meet the same fate.
Yeah. That's those invasions, they absolutely had devastating impact on the region, destroying and disrupting the existing social, cultural fabric, which was so pluralistic. And I think it's so important to understand those historical events and to grasp the complexities of the region, because they have an influence in the present. So I think we still live in that shadow of what happened in the past.
We do.
Yeah. And not to mention that the history of these frontiers, it's really important to understand them, because those frontiers are still vulnerable. And
they're very much vulnerable. They're still if I can say, they're still unsettled.
Yeah.
There's still conflict. There's still dispute. And you go into history, you always find that, because this was the civilizational corridor.
Yeah.
In India has always been, since ancient times, a very interesting place. A place where it is fertile, which is rich. So a civilizational corridor means anybody who would want to enter our civilization would take this corridor to come to us.
Yeah, and actually I was really intrigued by an idea that you mentioned about reviving these civilizational corridors and developing national education route. So could you talk about that? Because I thought that was just a fantastic idea.
Yeah, sure. I started to travel through my ancestral region. And so it was not just the history that I was discovering. I was obviously discovering a lot of contemporary problems as well, right? Like if I go as a tourist, I find the place beautiful, the sleepy villages, but that's as a tourist. If you're an insider and if you can talk to the people in their own language, we will realize that there is a parallel reality. In fact, there are multiple layers of realities. The region has already suffered a lot of neglect, I would say. It's only in the past few years, after 2019, that you actually see funding coming in, you see a lot of projects happening, you see some kind of a buzz, you see more official engagements, you see more administrative engagements. But the truth is also that the region has suffered a lot of neglect.
Yeah.
So today there are contemporary problems. And last year when I was organizing in this region, we had actually institutionalized a series of awards for the unsung heroes from this region. I happened to meet the local administration and they were talking about this entire region as also a narcotic route.
Okay.
So imagine, right? The routes are ancient because the routes are natural, the routes are geographical, the mountain passes are geographical.
Right.
And this is a very treacherous topography because of the mountains.
Yeah.
So through the same routes, the traders, the spiritual seekers have traveled, and now through the same routes, it's the terrorist, militants, army, and the narcotic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I started to study this region, I saw they were saying that a lot of this narcotics thing is happening through this region and is going into Himachal and Punjab through this region. So actually, this region also geographically is a tri-junction. It's a tri-junction between Himachal. So my ancestral region shares border with Kangra region of Himachal Pradesh.
Yeah.
And then Punjab, the Pathankot region of Punjab. Incidentally, a lot of these narcotic incidents were being reported from Himachal. So for example, there was a report in Tribune, which I can share with you. And when I read it last year, it mentioned that from a single village, in a short period of time, they had about 30 incidents of narcotics. So just imagine.
See.
And young people, including women, are actually getting engaged in it.
Mm.
Then I started to think about it because when I was organizing this campaign, I went to a very sleepy village in the hills and I knew there was no way to go. I had to arrange for a special vehicle. The road was broken at multiple points. And finally, I had to actually walk into this village. And when I was checking with the family, they said that only way for our children to go to the college was to every day first trek 1 hour. Now, trekking for a mountainous person is at a much faster pace than for people like you and I. Right? Yeah. So 1 hour trek that means like these are super capable mountain people.
Yeah.
And they were talking about a school which was in bad condition. And I have been working in this region for about 4 or 5 years now. And so I have a wide interface. And then I knew that the biggest need of the society today is life skills, education, skill-based education. And so I started to think about it. And then I thought, okay, this is a tri-junction. And to make it financially viable, this region, if narcotics is going through this region, then good things can also go through this region.
Yeah.
And so that's when I started to think about the educational viability of this region, the business viability of this region, the needs of this region. And I felt the best way would be to equip people with skill-based education and with life skills. So since we were talking about civilizational roots, which are today being abused by all kind of antisocial elements,
Right.
I thought of turning the same thing around and turning it into a national education route.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is
So I studied various regions which are in this route. For example, Basoli, which is on the bank of Himachal. It is known for a miniature style of painting called Basoli art. So I thought, okay, if this region is known for it, then it might be good to have a institution like the National Institute of Design, because then it will do justice to the heritage of that region.
Yeah.
So similarly, based on the needs of different regions, like where could be an institution which can build up leadership, where there can be an institution which can build up, lead to women empowerment. And So the region has massive needs because it has been neglected. And I think this can be a fabulous idea because the financial viability can be ensured through regions like Himachal and Punjab.
Yeah, I love these ideas. I love the idea of basically civilization renaissance through these routes and bringing back knowledge society that existed at one point, because our civilization places so much importance on learning and knowledge. So just fantastic ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it is also very important that today our entire comprehension of education and knowledge is very biased. It is something which we have learned from the West. No, I'm not saying that what the West has given to us doesn't have potential. I'm not saying that. I think it has a lot of potential and I think it has given us a lot of things. But within a civilizational context, we have our own comprehension of knowledge,
Yes.
which is extremely evolved, right? For example, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she's never been to school, but I find her the most intelligent person,
Yes.
and I feel that her life skills, which like today we are introducing life skills in school education and we're making life skills a part of curriculum. And we look at our grandparents who might not have gone to all these modern, so-called great institutions, but their skill sets, their competencies in some ways can be much more than us. In fact, we have imbibed those things from them.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
We have so much to teach us, and which is why what you're doing in terms of finding your personal stories, it just adds to that civilizational knowledge base. So I just love everything that you're doing. Thank you so much, Venus, for sharing what you've been doing. And finally, I just want to finish by saying that Kashmir is not limited to the valley. It's a reductive approach, just as the culture of the entire region has historically been much richer and deeply intertwined with the rest of the civilization. By recognizing the intertwined nature of civilizations, by appreciating the ecosystem of learning that once thrived in the region, by countering any attempts at erasure, we can work towards preserving and safeguarding the cultural heritage for future generations. And it is so critical that we do this because, remember, this whole region once embodied pluralism with deep Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, Sikhs, traditions all existing together. But, the changes in demography in recent centuries have caused a change in culture. And unfortunately, entire communities have disappeared, culture destroyed, the heritage has been practically erased. And they talk about settled colonizers. There has been a colonization, but of what kind and which culture is indigenous to this land? And those are the questions we must ask. And it's important that we keep the civilizational history alive, patching together individual stories the way you are. There's one way to rebuild this civilizational fabric. In fact, Venus offers a powerful approach to counter the erasure of heritage, to counter the deliberate attempts that are underway to erase and distort collective histories. And we can do that through the telling of personal stories as a means to revive civilizational memories, as she has done so beautifully. And this is something.
One more thing, Jayanthi, which is very important for us Indians, is that when we discover those stories, we discover the stories of our ancestors or these amazing, people with amazing kind of skills and genius, in our community or among our ancestors, then let's not just stop over there.
Yes.
Let's see how we can revitalize those things. How we can in the contemporary world, find a meaning of it.
Yes.
And that would be exactly a conscious attempt at preserving, because you can't just preserve something by just knowing about it if you don't carry it forward. And you cannot carry forward things the old way. Because times have moved on, things have changed, our lifestyle has changed. So we have to keep the core same, the fundamentals same, but we have to revitalize things and we have to find new meanings. For example, like you talked about these like biodiversity hotspots, so they can also be like civilizational hotspots. And civilizational hotspots can itself have multifaceted meanings in today's economic terms. So similarly, like converting ancient roots, ancient civilizational roots into educational highways. There can be many contemporary approaches the preserving our history, which would also mean preserving the skill sets,
Yes.
Preserving the genius, preserving the knowledge, traditions, and finding new meanings for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is something that we can all learn from by collecting and recording our own stories from our own families, just like you have done, because so much of our history is passed down from generation to generation. And by documenting these stories, we can all fight the distortion and erasure of our heritage. And thank you, Venus, for sharing your story, showing us the way, how to do this, because we all worry about this erasure, but here's the way. And thank you for informing us and inspiring us. We look forward to hearing more from you and spending more time learning about what you have discovered. Thanks again. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, Jayanthi. Thank you so much.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.